From Corrales' knockout revenge against Castillo, a fighter with every advantage, to Pacquiao catapulting himself towards 4 belts and superstardom, here are the most shocking boxing revenge stories. First, let's talk about Corrales delivering a 4th-round knockout with the odds stacked against him. It was one of the greatest revenge sagas in boxing history, a perfect example of a fighter coming back from insane odds and taking the victory. The first fight between the two lightweights was their title match back in 2005, and it looked to be easy pickings for Castillo. He laid the work on Diego for 10 straight rounds, and even knocked him down 2 separate times in the 10th. He was running a clinic, and Corrales looked like he had nowhere to come back from. The man's legs were shaking like a baby fawn's after that second knockdown, and the viciously swollen eye he sustained after all that punishment wasn't helping either. However, Diego took the advantage by declaring that he needed to replace his mouth guard, a controversial decision that gave him time to gather himself and recover, at a point where Jose would definitely have pressed his advantage. In the end, that second win worked, allowing Corrales to take down Castillo with 54 seconds left on the timer. Their next match 5 months later promised to be more of the same, with Corrales having an unfair advantage, as he was allowed to fight despite having failed to make weight, meaning he was heavier than his opponent. Instead of an easy victory for Corrales, it was clear that the heavy damage he'd sustained from their last fight was still bothering him, allowing Castillo to take his revenge by delivering a 4th-round knockout. Revenge matches are always spectacular to watch, especially when they show just how much a fighter can improve between matches, like when Norris leveled up all his specs for his comeback fight with Brown. The Norris vs. Brown duology played out like an anime season, showcasing exactly how much a fighter can improve with a solid training arc between matches, and what kind of tenacity is needed to overcome impossible odds. The first time Norris and Brown met in 1993 for their junior middleweight fight, it was an absolute blowout. Brown was just better in every single metric, completely outclassing his opponent through his superior technique, showcasing a gap in skill that led to Norris being knocked out pretty easily. Most fighters would have thrown in the towel, but Terry Norris had that X that all the boxing greats have, dedicating himself furiously to overcoming the skill gap, all with the goal of taking his revenge. The opportunity presented itself in 1994, where Norris put out an absolute clinic against his opponent, outclassing him in every way possible, and ultimately defeating him by a more than comfortable margin of points. For the fight, Terry had totally changed his fighting style to adapt to his opponent, improving his mobility by leaps and bounds, and focusing on hit-and-move tactics, frustrating his opponent every step of the way, and ultimately achieving victory. Even more impressively, he managed all of that while severely hurting his hand in the first round of the fight. Brown himself praised the victor, admitting that he was both outboxed and outmoved, a sentiment that even his own coach agreed with. Of course, sometimes sheer determination can overcome skill, like when Rocky Graziano went all out with the anime protagonist Tony Zale. This particular revenge fight was on the opposite end of the sports anime spectrum. Instead of a saga where a boxer overcame a skill difference through technical training, it showed how the most important thing a boxer can bring to the ring is sheer iron-hard willpower and grit. And boy oh boy did Rocky Graziano have grit in spades. Rocky's first bout with Tony Zale was all the way back in September 1946, a middleweight fight that Zale dominated. The man was a boxing veteran, and his surplus of experience showed with every punch thrown against his younger opponent, ultimately leading to a pretty comfortable knockout victory. The two met again in July 1947, and it soon became clear that Rocky was in a very different mindset from his first match. He didn't pull out any new styles or fancy tricks. Instead, he stood his ground for the entire fight, refusing to let his body fall while absorbing his opponent's punches, and decided to adopt the most basic but effective strategy possible. Power through the pain and land your punches as viciously as you possibly can through the barrage. His opponent just couldn't take it anymore and ended up collapsing in the 5th round. Sure, he claims that it was because of the heat, but it's much more likely that his body simply couldn't take the punishment that that the younger, stronger man was dishing out. Ultimately, the match ended in the 6th round with the victory going to Rocky, whose willpower would become famous for the entire world to see. Speaking of fights as amazing displays of energy and willpower, Sichu Powell must have installed new batteries in his second fight with Lattimore. The initial fight between the two legends was honestly pretty even initially. For the first 6 rounds, the two exchanged blow for blow, with neither side ready to back down, creating what was, for all intents and purposes, a vicious stalemate. However, stamina ultimately got the best of Powell, who was looking more and more lethargic as the fight went on, unable to keep up with the pace of Lattimore's onslaught. Simply put, his opponent was like a Daft Punk song, harder, better, faster, and stronger. When the rematch against the two was announced, fans thought it was going to end up being more of the same, with a gassed-out Powell being bullied around the ring. Instead, the underdog came back with a vengeance. The night of their rematch, Sichu looked like a completely different fighter, much more noticeably fresh and energetic as stepped into the ring. From the very first bell, he pressed DeAndre like there was no tomorrow, pummeling him so hard that it was almost cruel to watch. Lattimore even gave him a sign of respect at the end of the first round, touching his gloves as an admission of just how strong his opponent was in their revenge fight. In the end, the rematch went the whole 12-round distance and ended with Powell comfortably winning on point, a shining example of how much a player can change from fight to fight when the stakes are high, and the stakes are never higher than when a country's ego is at stake, as Joe Louis versus Max Schmeling played like a Rocky movie. Louis versus Schmeling plays out like Rocky IV, if you just replace the Cold War themes with the growing animosity between the US and Germany during the initial rise of Hitler's Germany. Their two fights are like a movie saga. Schmeling absolutely manhandled Joe in their first fight in 1936, defeating him in the 12th round via knockout, and handing the American his first loss. Of course, the two would meet each other again in 1938 as a rematch for the coveted World Heavyweight title. The match had a ton of baggage attached to it, with the whole stage being framed as the US fighting against a representative of Hitler's Germany, putting a huge amount of pressure on Joe Louis. The thing is, no one really expected Louis to win after his last performance. Local American journalists were all critical of him, and even other renowned boxers didn't believe he actually stood a chance. In the end, the odds were stacked 2-1 against the American, something that he clearly never heard about, as he delivered one of the most electric one-sided comeback fights in boxing history. The Brown Bomber didn't give his opponent a second of breathing room, immediately rushing him with combinations the entire crowd could hear, and ultimately beating him in just 2 minutes and 4 seconds of the first round, catapulting Louis to unheard of stardom. Speaking of revenge matches that made people's careers, Manny Pacquiao's revenge bout against Marquez turned him into a legend. The first fight between Marquez and Pacquiao in 2004 was one of the most electric fights in history. The Filipino began the fight with a bang, sending his opponent to the floor 3 separate times in just the first round, showcasing just how good of a boxer he was. Of course, Marquez rallied himself almost instantly and proceeded to win almost every other round of the match. In the end, the scorecards for both fighters were even, with the fight ending in a draw. However, that clearly wasn't good enough for Pacquiao. In fact, he might even have won the match if the deciding scorecard hadn't completely ignored his 3 knockdowns in the first round, a controversial decision that is still talked about to this day. Regardless, Manny knew he had to prove himself in a rematch. This was back when the guy was still trying to make an actual name for himself in the boxing game. Everyone knew he was good, sure, but he was nowhere near in the conversation of one of the best to ever do it, and that was exactly where he wanted to be. Fans begged to see both fighters in the ring against each other again, and ultimately got their wish in 2008, in a fight that was simply titled Unfinished Business. This time, there would be no draws or second guesses, as Pacquiao went at his opponent like a man possessed, ultimately winning the fight by a split decision and becoming the first Asian boxer to ever win world titles in not just one unheard of, but 4 different weight classes, catapulting his career to unheard of stardom. There you have it, folks, from Pacquiao catapulting himself towards 4 belts and superstardom to Corraliz's knockout revenge against a fighter with every advantage. Those were the most shocking boxing revenge stories.